Coming up, the haunted house in Amityville, a genuine ghost story or an elaborate deception? In 1976, George and Kathy Lutz fled in terror from their home on Long Island. They claimed their dream house was infested with evil spirits.
Not something we're taught about, not something we understand, but it's out there. It's a true story.
14 months before, the house had been the scene of a brutal mass murder. Was it now the scene of a massive fraud?
I think it was proven that they were actively involved in planning a deliberate hoax.
Jay Anson's best-selling book, The Amityville Horror, was classified as nonfiction, then turned into a movie that became a box office sensation. The story centers on the Lutz family, who claimed their home was overrun by apparitions, bizarre noises, and other supernatural phenomena. Were they telling the truth or part of a money-making conspiracy? Join us for Amityville, Horror or Hoax?
In December 1975, the house at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York, sits vacant, and everyone in this quaint Long Island suburb knows why. In the very early hours of November 13, 1974, 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. took a high-powered hunting rifle and murdered all 6 of his family members in their sleep. Although DeFeo is still serving 6 consecutive 25-year-to-life prison terms, disturbing mysteries about the murders remain.
To this day, no one is certain how Ronald DeFeo Jr. killed his parents, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters, and nobody heard a thing, how none of them even woke up.
13 months later, despite the house's tragic history, newlyweds George and Kathy Lutz decide to buy the charming Dutch colonial set on Amityville's scenic waterfront. 28 days later, on January 14, 1976, George, Kathy, and Kathy's 3 children from a previous marriage abandoned the home and all of their possessions. In their first television interview in more than 20 years, the Lutzes maintained that they were driven out of the Amityville house by hostile supernatural forces.
There were too many things happening too often and confronting us constantly.
The sense for our very lives was there, and we chose to go and not return.
Taking with them nothing but a few changes of clothes, the Lutzes seek refuge at the nearby home of Kathy's mother. Little more than a week after fleeing the house, the Lutzes contact William Weber, the attorney for convicted murderer Ronald DeFeo Jr.
When I first met with the Lutzes, they told me a story about incidences that occurred to them and their children as a result of what they described was a phenomena in the house. And they wanted to know if I had any evidence during the trial or during my investigation that could help them. I didn't believe 90% of what they were saying, but admittedly I was interested in writing a book on the case. The book that we were contemplating had 3 parts to it. Whether DeFeo was a cold-blooded killer, whether he was criminally insane, or whether he was possessed by some supernatural force. And the reader was going to be left to decide for his or herself what Ronnie DeFeo was.
William Weber wanted to publish the Lutzes' story of strange phenomena as part of his book. The Lutzes, however, contend that they refused to sign the contract once they discovered that one of Weber's business partners was Ronald DeFeo Jr.
As far as we're concerned, we went to Mr. Weber in good faith. The idea that Mr. DeFeo was going to receive monies from this enterprise was just not something that made any sense to us to even consider.
The next phone call from William Weber was wanting a press conference, which was something that I really didn't want to do. And he said that if we didn't meet with him, that he would send the reporters to the school where the children were going, and they would get the information from the children.
tus
And under that
trailers.
threat,
Visita mi canal.
I agreed to the newspaper conference.
The Lutz's press conference is held in the offices of William Weber on February 16, 1976. Although they end their association with William Weber soon thereafter, news of the Lutz's ghostly tale spreads quickly, drawing caravans of concerned and curious locals to Amityville's newly dubbed House of Horrors. Meanwhile, George Lutz contacts a handful of area paranormal researchers concerning the strange phenomena in the house. Among them is the late Stephen Kaplan, founder of Long Island's Parapsychology Institute of America. The next phase of the controversy is about to begin.
My husband, Stephen, first became involved in the Amityville case when he got a call from George Lutz saying that he would like Steve to come and investigate the house.
And I said to George Lutz at the time, I'm going to investigate. My fee is $0, because if you're lying, I'm going to verbally rip you apart. But Lord, help you if you're lying to me, because I don't like lies. My time is precious. I'm going to waste it with garbage.
Days later, George Lutz abruptly calls off Kaplan's investigation.
When his credentials wouldn't check out and I found out he was representing himself as a vampirologist, we told him it was unfortunate, but we would have no more to do with him.
The Kaplans say that the Lutzes gave them a much different reason for canceling their investigation.
George Lutz said, well, you talked to the press. We didn't want any publicity. And Steve said, well, if you didn't want any publicity, why'd you call a press conference the other day?
We never called that press conference. William Weber called it.
The very next day, Stephen Kaplan tells a Long Island newspaper that he believes the Amityville case is a hoax. His first strike in what will become a 20-year crusade to expose the Lutz's story as a fraud.
I'm not on the take. I don't sell out, and I believe in integrity.
Mr. Kaplan told us rather clearly that Channel 7 was going to make him a star. Evidently, since I didn't contribute to helping him become famous, the only other way for him to become famous was to call the whole thing a hoax.
Though what actually transpired between Kaplan and the Lutzes remains the subject of debate, George and Kathy continue their search for a paranormal researcher. Enter Laura DiDio, then a 19-year-old intern with a local television news station.
At the time, I'm an aspiring reporter. I just wanted to be Lois Lane, Brenda Starr, Lana Lang. I said, wow, this would be a great story for the TV station. The Lutzes at the time were not talking to anybody. They did not really want to talk to the media.
Laura DiDio, he was the first person that came to us and said, look, I don't want anything to happen here that will hurt your family, and I'd like, if you don't mind, to check out the credibility of people that you involved in this investigation.
Young as I was at the time, I was still a cynical New Yorker. One of the things that struck me about their story is they seemed genuinely frightened and genuinely moved by whatever had happened to them in this house.
A few days later, DiDio introduces the Lutzes to self-proclaimed demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren. After their initial meeting, George and Kathy agree to let the Warrens investigate.
The Lutzes, I think, felt very calmed and comforted by the Warrens, who had a lot of experience in this field. Lorraine especially is a very, very sympathetic, motherly character.
It was not even 3 weeks after George and Kathy fled that we actually entered the house for the very first time.
Well, when we go into such a home as Amityville, and remember, it was not the Amityville Horror then, it was just another haunted house.
I remember going in with the Warrens, and of course you have that sense of anticipation, you know, where you get the little goosebumps, what's going to happen. On the one hand, you'd like to see something happen. On the other hand, you're a little afraid and spooked that if something does happen, you don't want to be in the eye of the storm.
On February 24, 1976, demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, accompanied by a television news crew, investigate the abandoned Lutz home in Amityville, New York.
The first thing that struck us when we went in was that you would have thought that they were just out for the afternoon. Everything was as they left it. I mean, they weren't kidding when they said they fled the house.
The overwhelming impression as I entered the foyer of that beautiful home the first time was sadness and depression. But I was in a home where horrible tragedy had occurred.
And of course, what you do remember is that 6 people were murdered in this house. So that's enough to make things spooky.
While inspecting the basement, Ed Warren claims to have encountered a terrifying, inhuman presence.
Suddenly it felt as though I were under a heavy waterfall, and the pressure was driving me down to the floor. And I commanded in the name of Jesus Christ what was there to reveal its identity. There was hundreds of pinpoints of what I can only describe as electricity. I understood and knew right at that point that what we were dealing with was no ghost. This was no ordinary haunted house. This, on a scale of 1 to 10, was a 10.
Days after their first visit to the house, the Warrens meet with Father Ralph Pecoraro. In a 1979 interview, the priest recalls what he experienced while blessing the Lutz's house.
I was sprinkling holy water, and I heard a rather deep voice behind me saying, "Get out." It seemed so directed toward me. I was really quite startled. I felt a slap at one point on the face. I felt somebody slap me, and there was nobody there.
We felt it was in our best interest never to go back in that house again. But we did go back in order to finish the research that we were doing.
At the Lutz's request, the Warrens returned to the Amityville house on the night of March 6, 1976, along with a contingent of psychics, paranormal researchers, and reporters. Among them are researcher Laura DiDio and a camera crew from New York's Channel 5 Metro Media News, who are on hand to film the investigation.
There must have been 15 or 20 people in the house that evening. We had other researchers from Duke University's very highly respected School of Parapsychology. And of course, there was myself, Marvin Scott, who was the on-camera reporter, and a couple of other reporters from radio stations.
And they asked me at one point to see if we should hold a seance. I was a little bit leery about doing that. I felt I was putting myself in jeopardy.
It's nothing. It's whatever's here. Whatever is here.
You're trying to harm them?
Yes, and it's something that comes at you and makes your heart speed up, that kind of thing.
Veteran newscaster Marvin Scott, who covered the event for the local TV station, recalls that the night he spent in the Amityville house was anything but sensational.
During the course of the seance, one of the psychics became ill and left the room. Another complained of a pounding heart. Personally, I felt a slight chill in the back of my neck. I didn't make much of it. After all, it was a cold February night.
It was a dangerous, dangerous night during that period of time. Yes, it was very intense that night.
At about 3:15 a.m., a second seance is conducted in the upstairs sewing room, the area where the Warrens believe the demonic force is the strongest.
And I said, I hope this is as close to hell as I'll ever get.
While I felt nothing, Lorraine said she felt something so horrific She felt it was from the very bowels of the earth. Often I'm asked if I was scared the night I spent in that house. Quite honestly, the night I spent watching the movie a few years later, the rowdy, pot-smoking audience was a lot more frightening than the night I spent in that house at 112 Ocean Avenue.
Marvin is from this, the same school of reporting that we all came from, which is show us, let's get this on tape. And I remember Marvin turning to me and said, I don't think we've really got it. It meaning a really good story, that sort of smoking gun that you always want to see on camera. There was nothing out of the ordinary that you actually saw, other than the impressions you heard from a psychic. Just because you give a ghost party doesn't mean the ghost and the demons and the goblins or whatever is there are going to show up and perform for you.
According to the Warrens, photographs taken during their investigation offer compelling evidence that supernatural forces were at work at 112 Ocean Avenue.
Remember that Gene Campbell, the man who took these pictures, is an expert. Well, you're looking at a face of what looks like a child. If you look at it, it looks like luminescent eyes, but it could be eyeglasses, it could be anything.
A demonic spirit. It can appear as anything it wants to appear as.
Although they insist that no children were present in the house when this photograph was taken, the Warrens admit that it has never been scientifically authenticated.
For the believer, no evidence is necessary. For the atheist and the skeptic, no evidence is possible. That settles it right there.
By the spring of 1976, George and Kathy Lutz forfeit their $24,000 investment in the Amityville house and move to California. Meanwhile, paranormal researcher Stephen Kaplan sets out to prove that the Amityville case is a not-so-clever hoax.
If you go back and get the original newspaper articles that first came out, the story changes each time there's a new version.
Although the Lutzes admit that certain aspects of their story were exaggerated and misrepresented by the press, they insist this had more to do with the sensation-starved media than with them.
That was just the beginning indication of what things the media would say and be wrong, would end up being quoted wrong, said wrong.
There's a possibility that anybody can be misquoted. However, that doesn't mean the story that they were telling is true.
As interest in the Lutzes' haunted house story grows, debunker Stephen Kaplan goes head-to-head against religious demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren on a series of radio and television programs.
I said to him one time on a program, you're a parapsychologist. You are Dr. Stephen Kaplan. Yes? What kind of instrumentation did you use?
All right, one of the scientific things we used is people to research the history of the house, to try to get an idea of the construction. And
yes, but what about in the house? Yeah, you're not answering the question, Steve.
Right. We had people with electric equipment inside the house.
What would you call that equipment?
I wouldn't have the terminology for that.
But you're a parapsychologist.
Yes, I am, but I'm not an electronics expert.
Soon their public debate sparks a bitter personal conflict that rages on to this day.
Ed and Lorraine Warren, I think, are the biggest phonies and the most dangerous people around because they are the type of individuals that scare people out of their homes. I believe the Warrens are taking advantage of the public. They make their living from this field. Unlike Stephen, he made his living from teaching.
He was no parapsychologist. He had no doctorate. The man was as phony as a $3 bill.
As the conflict between the Warrens and the Kaplans continues unabated, attorney William Weber contacts another paranormal expert, Professor Hans Holzer, regarding the still abandoned house at 112 Ocean Avenue. It is January 1977, nearly 1 year after the Lutzes ended their association with Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s trial lawyer.
Once Ronnie was convicted, the next line of attack was to appeal the case. And that's what was done.
William Weber came to me when the young man was already in jail and asked whether I could help reopen the case on the basis of what my findings were.
Today, however, William Weber denies ever having requested Holzer's help with Ronald DeFeo's appeal.
Tus trailers.
I don't recall
Visita mi
whether
canal.
look, I may have called Hans Holzer in, but it certainly wasn't to investigate the case. Hans Holzer was not, as I recall it, brought in to effect an appeal, although Hans had strong feelings that Ronnie was definitely possessed.
On January 13th, 1977, Hans Holzer visits 112 Ocean Avenue with deep trance medium Ethel Johnson Myers. Using her psychic abilities, Mrs. Myers theorizes that the house is built on sacred Indian burial ground.
The Indian force takes over. When it takes over, it's deadly.
Photographs taken during Holzer's investigation show what he believes is evidence of paranormal activity.
Superimposed on the scene of me standing up in front of the entranced medium, there appears to be white matter, which we call ectoplasm, and it is quite clearly a man on a horse.
Hans Holzer continues his investigation at the Amityville Historical Society, where the curator reveals that the skeleton of an Indian chief had been unearthed on Ocean Avenue during the early part of the 20th century.
I'm convinced that Ronald DeFeo was under the power and the influence of the Indian when these things occurred.
The ever-skeptical Kaplans, however, question Holzer's motives.
I think Dr. Holzer is heavily into mixing truth with fiction. He had a contract for a book about the Amityville case, so he had a motivation to say that there was something there. I know that a lot of the things in the books that he wrote were disproved. There was no Indian burial ground under the house. The Indians did not bury their dead near the water. Hans Holzer, I believe, just decided to put it there because it was more convenient.
One must remember that over 300 years or 400 years, the erosion that has taken place has caused the water to shift its table and either rise or fall. So a lot of our burials are underwater. So would the spirit be in water? Absolutely.
For his part, Hans Holzer questions Stephen Kaplan's motives for decrying the Amityville case as a hoax.
And when he found out I was involved with the Amityville house, and he asked, could I come along? Please, I want to come along to the house the next time you go. And I just as politely explained to him that that was not possible. He then turned against me and complained that the whole thing was a hoax. That's how this whole thing started.
My husband, Stephen, was not jealous of Hans Holzer. He didn't particularly care for his style of research or think that the things that he wrote about were true. And he certainly never begged Hans Holzer to go to the house with him. No, that's just total baloney.
Despite the claims of doubters and skeptics, Hans Holzer still believes that a powerful spiritual force is at work in the Amityville house.
This is not a haunted house per se. It is a relationship between a very angry spirit and someone to whom he can speak. I personally have great sympathy with the Indian chief because his land, his tomb, was desecrated, but on the other hand, there was murder.
In the early weeks and months after fleeing the Amityville horror house, George and Kathy Lutz claimed to have recorded a series of audio tapes in an attempt to make sense out of the 28 harrowing days they spent there. The Lutzes recall specific events and their reactions to them, but find it difficult to pinpoint exact times and dates.
In the process of doing those tapes, we discovered how many things we remembered individually from a different point of view or a different perspective. If I were to describe a noise that was incredibly loud, like the marching band walking around downstairs, Kathy could be asleep through it. And I couldn't understand how anybody could sleep through such a thing. But she could wake up and remember being touched from behind by someone when there was no one else in the house.
In 1977, What begins as a local interest story in the Long Island press snowballs into a national media frenzy that puts the Lutzes directly in the public spotlight.
The whole Amityville horror began to take on a life of its own. This is a couple of years after The Exorcist, so maybe people were just in the right frame of mind for a really good ghost story. But the interest in this house and what happened there rose to a fever pitch.
Visita mi canal.
The first national article chronicling the Lutzes' 28-day ordeal appears in the April 1977 edition of Good Housekeeping magazine. The article is written by Paul Hoffman, who had met the Lutzes 1 year earlier through attorney William Weber.
At that point, I was interested in writing a book on the case, and I had brought in Paul Hoffman to assist me in writing the book.
Hoffman never had permission from us to go ahead and print that article. We sued Good Housekeeping, we sued Hoffman, we sued Weber.
Shortly before moving to California in the spring of 1976, the Lutzes are introduced to Tam Mossman, an editor for the publishing firm of Prentice Hall. Mossman is intrigued by their story and recommends hiring Jay Anson, an established writer of documentary films, to write a book based on their experiences. Anson suggests calling it The Amityville Horror.
Kathy and I agonized over the decision whether this should be a book, whether we should stand up to the ridicule that was obviously going to happen. The choice was ours. It was a free choice. We made it together.
The Amityville Horror is published in the fall of 1977, its subtitle boldly proclaiming it to be a true story. Although reviews are mixed, strong word of mouth bolstered by a national publicity campaign turned the book into an overnight sensation. Meanwhile, the relentless Stephen Kaplan tries to persuade the public that this supposed true story is an outright fraud.
If you compare the original edition of the hardcover version of the Amityville Horror with the first paperback edition, you will see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of changes that they made. According to the hardcover, the priest was driving on the expressway when the hood of his car suddenly flew open and smashed his windshield. This was impossible because he was driving a Chevy Vega and the hood opened the other way. It couldn't have smashed the windshield. So they changed it to a tan Ford in the paperback. George Lutz claimed that the front door flew off its hinges, and what it was the screen door. The wooden door was still there in place. When we saw the house, it was the screen door that was hanging, and in winter on Long Island next to the water, it's not unusual to lose a screen door.
When George and Kathy Lutz said to Jay Anson in those tapes that the door exploded before their very eyes, Jay Anson didn't explain how it happened. It's a telepathic illusion. There was no physical door exploded. In other words, you and I could be in a room together. You see a ghost, I don't see it. That's because the ghost has projected its image to you, not me. That's what George and Kathy would see many times, and that's how ghosts are seen, telepathically.
But do the factual errors and dramatic embellishments found in Jay Anson's book prove that the Lutzes conspired to create a hoax?
When you change a Chevy Vega to a tan Ford because it doesn't fit your profile of what happened to the priest, that's an out-and-out deception. I don't think anything can be 100% accurate, but when you read something as nonfiction, I think the public has a right to demand that the large majority of what's in there is the truth.
Attorney William Weber contends that the Lutzes had always planned to cash in on the DeFeo murder tragedy, starting from the time they decided to buy the house.
The Lutzes' game plan was to make a commercial venture of their living in the DeFeo residence. There's no question in my mind that that was their aim and their goal.
Why would Weber accuse us of concocting a hoax with him and then make us swear in a contract that he wanted us to sign that we would absolutely tell the truth and agree to take polygraph tests?
William Weber at no time intimated that the Amityville case was a hoax. He was not committed to parapsychology, but he told me more than once that he was fully convinced that the possession theory was the most likely. If he has said that he thought it was a fraud, well, he has his reasons for it. I don't know what they are, but it's not true.
Let's pursue the theory that, in fact, the Lutzes had this grand master scheme, that they were going to come in, create a haunted house story. First of all, they left their whole investment, their life savings, was wrapped up in this house. There have been lots of haunted house stories throughout the ages, but you don't know which ones are going to take off and capture the public's imagination. The odds would be against them making a lot of money off of a haunted house.
The thing is this, that if you're going to create a hoax, you're going to make sure that you get your share of the money. Now remember that George and Kathy made some money, but they didn't make the money that the producers and Jay Anson made. They became wealthy. George and Kathy never did.
But how much did the Lutzes profit from the Amityville horror?
I think we probably made a little over $250,000 from the original book. Somewhere around $160,000 from the movie, total, to date. More than 1/3 of that went to lawyers easily, or not so easily, defending lawsuits.
One of the first lawsuits brought against the Lutzes is the one filed by Jim and Barbara Cromartie, who buy the Ocean Avenue house in the spring of 1977. The Cromarties, who see no evidence that the house is haunted, soon find their own lives turned upside down, not by demons or evil spirits, but by the hundreds of tourists and would-be ghost hunters who besiege their home. Claiming that the Amityville horror is directly responsible for their plight, the Cromarties sue Jay Anson, publisher Prentice Hall, and the Lutzes for invasion of privacy.
The real horror of that house was, number one, the horrible murders that took place, and number two, the subsequent harassment of all the owners that tried to live there and live a normal life.
Although the Cromarties eventually settled their lawsuit for an undisclosed sum, the constant harassment by the media and the public forces them to move out of the house after only 2 years.
Let me ask you a question. 6 people were murdered in that house. 5 people were driven out of there 28 days after they lived there. Would you live in that house?
After the phenomenal success of Jay Anson's novel, which goes through 13 printings and sells more than 10 million copies, the motion picture version of the Amityville horror is released by American International Pictures on July 27, 1979. Starring James Brolin and Margot Kidder and boasting an eye-catching ad campaign, the film goes on to become one of the biggest blockbusters of the summer, taking in nearly $80 million at the box office. Days before the movie's release, however, attorney William Weber tells the Associated Press that he participated in the creation of the story and that he is now suing George and Kathy Lutz for stealing the ideas he had suggested to them as part of his own never-realized book project in 1976.
When I first met with the Lutzes, we spent literally, I would say, 5 or 6 hours over several bottles of wine that they graciously produced. And that's when talk as to the slime on the doors and the toilets and around windowsills took place. I had suggested certain phenomena could be interpreted as supernatural phenomena. But I knew all along that it was just a commercial venture and it was a fabricated part, and it wasn't true.
Mr. Weber was very inaccurate to say that he provided us with any materials that ended up in the Amityville horror. The real problem with answering Mr. Weber is that he can pretty much say what he wants, and I don't feel like going back to court to fight him again. It's unfortunate that some people just seem to go a little nuts when all of this came back.
In June of 1979, American International Pictures asks George and Kathy Lutz to submit to polygraph tests, during which they answer questions about their experiences in Amityville. They both pass.
The polygraph tests that the Lutzes took were conducted by the Star tabloid. I really don't give much credence to that. They only wanted to be tested by certain experts in quotes, hired by the Star, who was then paying them for writing a story about them.
Does this woman actually believe what she's saying when she says these things? The Star had absolutely nothing to do with that test. When American International Pictures said they would pay for the tests, we said we would like them to be with the most qualified people that they can find. They picked Chris Gugas and Michael Rice, who were considered at that time, I think, number 3 in the country for conducting the test.
In September of 1979, Reverend Ralph J. Pecoraro, the Catholic priest who blessed the Amityville house, is ordered to testify in federal court in the $2 million countersuit filed against the Lutzes by attorney William Weber. Father Pecoraro swears under oath that he did, in fact, hear a disembodied voice in the house tell him to get out. But he can neither confirm nor deny that the resulting terrors portrayed in the book or the film ever actually happened. Yet even as an out-of-court settlement is reached in the case, reports of strange phenomena continue to surround those involved in the Amityville horror.
After I had finished the manuscript, I had turned it over to my editor to take back to Prentice Hall in New Jersey. His car caught on fire. An accident. I gave a copy of the manuscript to another friend, and there was a rainstorm, and he went through what he thought was a puddle. It turned out to be a pothole. His whole car sank. It was a total wreck. The only thing that was dry in the whole car was the manuscript. The 2 incidents that took place after that kind of shake me a little bit, because I had given the first 2 chapters to a friend of mine, a woman named Frances Evans. And she took it home, and she died in a fire that night. She and 2 daughters were killed.
Unfortunately, author Jay Anson does not get to enjoy the success of the Amityville horror for very long. He dies of a heart attack in March 1980 at the age of 59, shortly after completing his second novel titled 666, a reference to the biblical number for Satan. In perhaps the most startling twist of fate, case debunker Stephen Kaplan suffers a fatal heart attack just weeks before the publication of his 20-year expose, The Amityville Horror Conspiracy. Although nearly 3 decades have passed since a bizarre chain of events unceremoniously placed a quaint Long Island village on the map, those who fought to prove the Amityville horror a hoax still insist that there are no ghosts at 112 Ocean Avenue, and never were.
Today, if anyone asked me if the former DeFeo residence on Ocean Avenue was haunted, I would simply say, why don't you wait until I write a book and you could buy it to find out. But I would be saying that facetiously, because the house has never been haunted. It isn't haunted today. And the Lutzes, they have my congratulations. They made a very successful commercial venture, and they pulled the wool over the public's eyes.
In general, I believe that there could be some kind of residual feeling left over in the house where a terrible murder had been committed. In this particular house, I couldn't tell you. It has just as much of a chance of having strange phenomena as any other house. But because of all the lies that were told and all the deceptions, we'll never know.
Despite the years of lawsuits and media harassment, the Lutzes maintain to this day that their experiences in Amityville were real.
Some people have called our testimony about Amityville a hoax. There is nothing that I could say to them. There is nothing I could show them. There would be new evidence that this is a truth. It is the truth. It is my testimony. It is where I came from. And to judge another's testimony, not having experienced it, not having gone through it, or been touched by it, You don't have the right to. Yours is just an opinion. And the opinion doesn't hold water.
I believe this has stayed alive for 25 years because it's a true story. It doesn't mean that everything that's ever been said about it is true. It's certainly not a hoax. It's real easy to call something a hoax. I wish it was. It's not.
Hoax or not, the home on Ocean Avenue remains at the center of the world's best-known haunted house controversy. Since the Lutzes moved out, no other occupants have reported any bizarre occurrences or supernatural visitors. The only haunting has been done by tourists, who are sometimes brazen enough to walk up and knock on the front door, hoping for a peek inside the home that gave Amityville its unfortunate notoriety.